again, everybody. This is Doc with Thorofan, and of course the big news that kind of broke over the holiday season was the fact that first the California State Veterinary Board was investigating Dr. Jeff Blee, who is the current equine medical director of the California Horse Racing Board, and then the news that just came out very, very recently that they decided to, as a result of that investigation, issue a temporary suspension of his license. I think there is some confusion there among racing folks and racing fans as to exactly what that means and if that affects his standing with the CHRB, if that affects any other licenses he holds, things of that nature. So I figured this would be a good opportunity to have a little sit down and delve a little deeper as we go ahead and discuss what it takes to both get and maintain a veterinary license in the United States. So what we know so far is that Dr. Jeff Blee had his veterinary license temporarily suspended by the California State Veterinary Board. And this is something that's different from any licenses that are granted by the California Horse Racing Board. They're two separate entities. They're both controlled by the state, but they're two separate entities. And for anybody to practice veterinary medicine in a state, they do need to become licensed to practice veterinary medicine in that state. So for example, I live in northeastern Pennsylvania, so a majority of my practice work is done in Pennsylvania, so I obviously need a license from Pennsylvania to practice. However, I also do some work up in New York, so in order to practice veterinary medicine in New York, I also needed to obtain a New York State veterinary license. There is no real universal veterinary license. There is kind of one exception in there if you're doing government work or research sometimes, but for the purpose of practicing veterinary medicine in the United States or Canada, you do need to have that state's or province's veterinary licensure in place in order to do that. And in order to obtain a state veterinary license or provincial veterinary license, there's usually a couple of steps that everybody has to get through. The first of which, of course, is graduating from a veterinary school and having a diploma for that. The second is taking what's known as the North American Veterinary Licensing Exam, or the NAVLE as we call it. And this is kind of a test that most students end up taking in the middle of their fourth year of veterinary school, and it just shows that you have the basic background knowledge in veterinary medicine and the various disease conditions, things of that nature, to be able to go out and competently practice veterinary medicine once you graduate. Not every student passes that on the first try. Most do, but most will pass it by the second try. Consider it sort of like the bar exam for lawyers, but it's not totally quite the same thing. But that would probably be the best equivalent that I could put out there. Now, once you have those two things in hand, and you go to practice in a certain state, you then have to apply to that state's, usually Department of State, for a veterinary license to practice. And the requirements for that can vary from state to state. So, for instance, in Pennsylvania, usually when you apply, it involves basically filling out an application, paying an application fee, and also answering some questions kind of on the level of jurisprudence, so understanding the laws regulating veterinary medicine in that state. Other states, like California per se, have a much more detailed exam that you have to take to show that you do have all of the knowledge necessary. So it is veterinary law related, apparently, in that exam from what I'm told. And then once you pass that exam, make sure that your fees are checked and everything's good, and they don't find anything on your record, such as felonies or whatever that might, disqualify you from having a veterinary license, you will be licensed to practice in that state. Most licenses last for about 2 years. They're usually renewed every 2 years, and in order to keep your veterinary license, you have to complete and show that you've completed so many hours of continuing education in veterinary medicine over those 2 years in order to be continually licensed, and that usually requires paying the fee every year to renew your license. So that's a veterinary license. Now, the state boards that are out there and the veterinary licenses are controlled and adjudicated by the State Board of Veterinary Medicine. So be it the Pennsylvania State Board of Vet Med, the New York State Board of Vet Med, California State Board of Vet Med, whatever state you're in, they're the ones that oversee all of this. And those entities are usually what we call a complaint-driven entity, which means that in most cases, the state board is not going to go out and just on a whim investigate a veterinarian or their practices. Some places are starting to do that, and they're just doing regular kind of evaluations of veterinarians, their practices, their record keeping, to try to get on top of things before they become a problem. But in most cases, if a complaint is going to come to the state board, it's going to come from a member of the public. And that seems to be sort of what happened a little bit here in the California cases, where an anonymous complaint was put in about these allegations that Dr. Blee was prescribing medication to multiple horses without the proper paperwork, giving medications that really shouldn't have been given based on lack of medical evidence of those being needed. Thyroxine, again, once again, reared its ugly head in some of those instances. So that's what the state board investigates. And then once that investigation is done, they come to a decision as to how to best serve any or determine first, I should say, if any violations occurred, and then determine what the punishment should be for those violations. Now, I will say from talking to veterinarians in California, California tends to be one of the most strict, if not one of the strictest state boards in the country when it comes to violations. They do not take to them kindly, and they will punish people pretty harshly for them. So in some ways, this temporary suspension is not so much of a surprise, coming from California. I don't know if in another state, maybe they wouldn't have looked at it in such the same light as California did, but that's kind of neither here nor there because we're talking about California. So then usually a hearing is held, and the respondent or the person that is being accused, the vet that's being accused, has a chance to present their side of the case, usually with legal representation, and then again a decision was made. So this hearing was held on an emergency basis Christmas Eve morning. That shows you how serious the California State Board was taking this, because they are not going to call an emergency hearing on something like this on Christmas Eve morning unless it is something in their minds that is very serious. So, and then they heard both sides. They made their judgment, which is a temporary suspension. There's probably going to be another hearing to further look at some of the evidence and maybe decide if that suspension is going to be permanent. If they're going to permanently suspend his license, or if they're going to potentially give it back over some period of time. Usually, the other penalties that fall into these realms are having fines issued against you, potentially being required to carry out so many continuing education hours in a specific area. So, for instance, if a veterinarian is deficient in record keeping, you have to show that you completed 6 hours in continuing education regarding record keeping, things like that, and present proof of that to the state board. But the penalties can really vary just depending on what state or province you're in. So that's what happens with the state veterinary board. So with his license suspended, he is not permitted to practice veterinary medicine in the state of California. Could he try to, if he's licensed in other states, practice in those states? Yes. I will say that a lot of times states will reciprocate. And if a license is suspended in one state, normally they're going to reciprocate that and at least temporarily suspend it in another state as well. But that doesn't always happen. Again, he has the right to plead his case and, ask that state not to suspend his license. Or, they may wait pending a potential appeal that he files, or if they're waiting for a more official hearing to be done, with more evidence presented. We just don't know. We're going to have to wait. That's going to come in time. So that's the veterinary side of things. So that's the veterinary license side. What I think people are confusing it with is his role with the California Horse Racing Board, and even the media is kind of getting this wrong because they're making it sound like the California Horse Racing Board is the one that came down and suspended him, and that's not true. In most cases, to go ahead and practice veterinary medicine on the backside of a racetrack, on the racetrack, or at a training center that's overseen by a state racing commission, you then have to apply also for a license from that state racing commission or state racing board to do that. And usually the requirements of that are having a license that is a veterinary license that is in good standing with that state. That's one of the major requirements. And of course, they'll do other background checks and all of that. So right now, in theory, with his license suspended in California to practice veterinary medicine, he would not be allowed to practice on the backside. He would not be allowed to do any kind of veterinary work on the backside. Where it gets a little interesting is the fact that his official title is Equine Medical Director of the California Horse Racing Board. Now, when you look a little bit deeper into the California Horse Racing Board rules, he can keep that post because they do not have that needs a veterinary license that is active or in good standing to maintain as equine medical director. Now, they're going to be holding a hearing, of course, a closed-door hearing because it's California and they never do anything open door. to determine exactly what the California Horse Racing Board wants to do. They could, I'm assuming, they could go ahead and suspend him for a period of time. They could remove him from that post. There's probably some other options out there. So we're just going to have to wait until January 20th to see what happens there. But just remember, everybody, that these are two different entities. They're both controlled by the state, but they're two different entities. So, his ability to remain as equine medical director right now is there. They haven't issued any kind of emergency suspension of him or anything like that. He is just not permitted to practice veterinary medicine in the state of California until this license suspension is either lifted or a more specific period of time is determined for how long it will be suspended. So I hope that kind of helps clear up a little bit of misinformation on that. And like I said, mainstream media is even getting this a little wrong. They're not writing their headlines the right way. But of course, this is attracting the most attention because Dr. Blee was the one that was technically overseeing the investigation into the sudden death of Medina Spirit. And really, that is his job for any horse that suffers a sudden death or catastrophic injury death on the racetrack during training or racing. That's his job. He oversees all of those investigations. So now the question is, will people trust whatever comes out of that report? Because now some of these things about his past transgressions on the racetrack, if you want to call them that, or at least accusations on the racetrack are coming to light through these investigations. Should he be allowed to still oversee it? And would he be really considered an independent party in overseeing all this? And that, of course, all remains to be seen. We don't know what's going to happen. So we're just going to have to keep following this. Thoroughfan will be following a lot of this closely and seeing exactly where everything goes. But again, I do hope that kind of helps clear up at least a little bit of maybe the misconception of the way things work in the veterinary licensure world when it comes to horse racing. But of course, if you have any questions, feel free to drop us a line in the comments. We will try to go ahead and answer them if I didn't make anything super clear here, as sometimes I am accused of not being able to do. But until that time, I am Doc for Thoroughfan, and as always, if you, the racing fan, want to know anything and everything that is going on in the world of thoroughbred horse racing, you really want to hit up the only place where information is provided for the fans by the fans, and that's right here at Thoroughfan.